Welcome, this is Najma Minhas with Global Village Space. Last week's tit-for-tat closures, with the United States closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, and China asking the United States to do the same in Chengdu, along with Secretary of State Pompeo's comments on China being internally authoritarian and externally aggressive, have brought both countries to a precipice of no return. To understand where they are and can they move back, I have with me prominent TV anchor and political commentator, Dr. Moeed Pirzada. Moeed, thank you for joining me.
Najma, thanks for inviting me.
Moeed, tell me, what is the significance of closing these consulates?
You see, whereas there are long-standing historical reasons and things have been moving in that direction, and this clash, which is now taking place between China and the United States, was in a way inevitable. But right now, the immediate intensification is taking place because of the US November elections, which are now only 3 months and few days away. And it appears that Donald Trump and his team, his cabinet, have clearly made up a mind to fight the US elections on an anti-China card. This is as much against China as it's against the Democrats and against the Biden.
When you say it's as much against China as it is against the Biden, the Democrats and the Republicans are united on this issue. So, I mean, how can he win on this card? It doesn't differentiate him.
No doubt, of course, agreed. I mean, you're right that there has been a bipartisan consensus. There has been a growing bipartisan consensus. But Republicans, Trump and his team can easily blame Obama administration and Democrats for giving an unprecedented access to the Chinese, for not really restricting the trade imbalance between China and United States, for not really doing enough for China's expansion in the South China Sea, for China's theft of the intellectual property, for China's stealing of the American jobs. I mean, there are three principal predominant narratives, three points of this predominant narrative, the American narrative, the common narrative. The Chinese have stolen the American jobs. Chinese have stolen the American influence and power, and they have stolen the American technology, the intellectual property, the American creativity, and there's a trade imbalance.
Well, the United States has started declaring this as a Cold War. Do you think it's actually lulling itself into believing that it can win this because it won against Russia in 1988? Is China as Russia was in 1988?
To the first point, it's true that United States and all its allies, its think tanks, its allies in India, in Singapore, many other parts of the world are giving the impression that it's a replay of the Cold War that was played between the Soviet Union, that was played against the Soviet Union from 1949 onwards, and that the United States can win it again. But all serious commentators realize that there are fundamental differences between the Soviet Union and China, and also between the American, the level of the American dominance in the world since 1950. But Soviet Union was a creation of war. I mean, when you look at the Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union in 1918, was immediately attacked by the White Revolution, which was being supported by United States and other Western countries, United Kingdom, France. In 1921, the Bolsheviks were finally able to defeat the White Armies of the White Revolution. So Soviet Union itself was created as a result. From the very beginning, it had a 3-year-long war against the Western armies. Then in Second World War, Soviet Union was effectively and very successfully attacked by a major Western power, that is the Nazi Germany. And the Western Alliance, UK and United States, never really helped Soviet Union fight that war. In fact, it was the Soviet war machine and the resurgence and resurrection of the Soviet war machine that helped the United States and UK in decisively defeating the Nazi Germany. But immediately, so Soviet Union was an ally, so the Western powers, United States, UK, divided the world into zones of influence along with the Soviet Union's in Yalta in 1945-44 agreement. But then immediately after the war, when George Kennan wrote the long telegram, from 1949 onwards, it was decided the Soviet Union must be confronted and must be destroyed, or must be contained, right? And then Soviet Union itself was a huge military power that occupied countries and punished countries in East Europe. There were military expeditions against the East European countries. Germany itself was divided. China is nothing like that. Soviet
So
Union.
do you think the US is
But
viewing China?
One point more. China is a nation state. There might actually be some disputes in the periphery, but China is a humongous nation state of 1.4 billion people that has evolved in its present form over a time period of almost at least 3,000 years, right? It's not an imperialistic structuring the way the Soviet Union was, and it is not a function. Its entry into the global system is a legalistic negotiated entry. It hasn't really entered the global system by fighting against the West. Yes, it was outside the mainstream till 1970, but it's not a militaristic competitor to the Western world.
How do you explain what it's doing in South China Seas then, if it's not militaristic? But before we get to that,
It's very minor.
what I want to try and understand is the US viewing China correctly as it viewed the USSR in 1946, or is it viewing Russia in 1988? Because those are two different positions that the Soviet Union was. And is the US therefore preparing for a 50-year war, or is it thinking this is a very short-term war where it's going to win?
Look, I think the Americans from the very beginning, while China was allowed to grow if you look at the American think tanks, professors of all sorts, academia, politician, it looks as if the Americans have deluded in believing themselves that the China's rise has happened as a result of some sort of kindness or generosity on the part of the United States. It is totally ignored that China's rise happened as a result of an American need. First, in order to divide the communist world from 1960s and 70s onwards, it was the schism between the Soviet Union and China that allowed the United States to exert its muscle against the Soviet Union and to dominate the stage from 1970s onwards. If China had not been effectively divorced from Soviet Union, then Soviet Union would not have been left alone on the global theater. The second is that the design was from 1980s onwards, from 1979 resumption of diplomatic relationship, that as the China will economically liberalize, we will also be able to liberalize China politically. And when you use the word liberalize China, this is actually a beautiful packaging of a desire that we will actually get access and penetration into the Chinese system.
Right.
And
so like the Glasnost
Glasnost and Perestroika, thank you so much for the terms. Henry Kissinger wrote a piece in late 1989 or 1990, arguing this thing that Chinese are doing a strategic mistake and Russia will actually emerge victorious in the historic gamble, because Russia is not only economically reconstructing itself, which is Perestroika, but is also opening itself politically and becoming a democracy in the Glasnost. So what happened as a result of it, in 10 years' time, the Soviet Union turning into Russia lost all its importance under Boris Yeltsin on the global stage, till Putin comes in and starts resurrecting it. Chinese, on the other hand, said, thank you, we will do the economic reconstruction, but we would not open ourselves politically. But if Chinese had also opened themselves politically the way Russia did, then the specter was that US and Western institutions could have gone and taken control of the Chinese politics from within it. For instance, they complain in countries like Pakistan that when these old organizations come, funded by the Western organizations of the governments, then they start creating a political structure or demand from within. So liberalization is not a generic term as liberalization, that means westernization. So China has not allowed itself to be westernized the way the America and its allies wanted.
So if you think that in terms of the Cold War, we're still at the beginning process of the Cold War, if it's let's say a 40-year-old Cold War, if we take retrospectively what happened in the last Cold War, do you think we're going to see proxy wars the way we saw in Vietnam or in Korea or in Afghanistan? I mean, what are the potential proxy wars that we may see under this new Cold War?
Perhaps not with the same intensity, because as we mentioned earlier, it was discussed earlier that Soviet Union was basically a militaristic alliance. It was a huge militaristic alliance that could challenge the United States and allies eyeball to eyeball. I mean, it was a threat to the security of Western Europe. China is not a military power the way Soviet Union was. I mean, sometimes people in Pakistan exaggerate the Chinese military muscle, but China is nowhere close to the kind of military potential United States has, right? But proxy conflict, yes. The Belt and Road Initiative, is being confronted in various parts of the world, politically, economically, and whatever. One of the immediate spectre of the proxy conflict is in Pakistan. We already have seen that the Belt and Road Initiative's component, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, can actually be threatened in Gilgit-Baltistan, can be threatened in Baluchistan, can be threatened around the port of Gwadar. So India, Pakistan, and China getting involved into some sort of intensified proxy conflict, depending upon how much the India is playing to play balls, which I'm not really sure that India will play ball as much as many in United States want them to play. But yes, the proxy conflict can take form.
Do you think China is ready to economically take on the United States? I mean, do you think Xi has not followed Deng's dictum, which is hide your brightness and bide your time?
It can be said. I mean, the law of argument that Xi Jinping has not been as wise, and his Belt and Road Initiative was perhaps preposterous and premature. It probably came 10 years earlier, or 7 years earlier, or 8 years earlier, and it has unnerved. But, having said this, it also looks that what is not being discussed is that how the Anglo-Saxon core of the Western politics, within the large Western alliance, there is an Anglo-Saxon core, which is United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the Anglo-Saxon core. How quickly in the last 10 years the Anglo-Saxon core has become insecure and unnerved as a result of the globalization which they themselves promoted and advocated for almost 100 years. The way Britain ran away from Brexit as a result of the older generation of the British living in the north of England, lesser educated Britishers outside the cities of London, how they were insecure because of the European workers, and how they ended up destroying the potential of some of the finest thing which the Western Alliance have created in the past 100 years in the form of the European Union. And the rise of the Trumpian politics, where lesser educated white Americans, not the highly educated, because these are not the highly educated university graduates, the lesser educated Americans living in smaller towns within the central United States have started thinking that America's greatness has been stolen by China, India, and rest of the world. And look at these Indian high-tech IT professionals and doctors. I mean, if you look at the rise of the South Asian diaspora and the Chinese diaspora within United States, I mean, they constitute a significant percentage of extremely high income groups and extremely successful people that live in the suburban towns. And then the rise of the gay and lesbian politics, the liberal politics, the minority politics,
which is all threatening the conservative base of Trump.
So the conservative, ultra-conservative, white supremacist and ultra-conservative orthodox United States has been threatened by the rise of the rest, as Zakaria says. And that has led to the rise of the Trumpian politics. I mean, a black American president.
No, but when we talk about the Cold War in 1945 happened in a context where you had the Bretton Woods, you later had GATT, and then it became the WTO. So we had a whole global trading system. Now what's happening is you have Trump's first America First policy, you have China with its Made in China 2025 policy, and you have India now saying let's have a Made in India policy. Now if each block of countries, or increasingly large countries, if the world's top 3-4 countries start making Made in India, Made in China themselves, what does this say for a global harmonious trading situation?
This is definitely a huge risk to the global economic order, the way it was created as a result of Second World War and Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, if you look at some of the figures, that 40% of the global GDP and the product is produced by two countries, United States and China, right? And the way they're interdependent upon each other. One of the biggest heartburning for the American policymakers and Donald Trump and his party and supporters are that there is about $650 billion, when I last checked the figures, bilateral trade between China and United States. And out of that, about $530 or $40 billion is the Chinese imports into United States, and only about $120 or $30 billion.
So how can you have a Cold War? I mean, America was never economically dependent on Russia or the Soviet Union. But it is with China. So how can you have a Cold War existing?
Exactly, that's a very big question. I mean, people are still mulling over it. Because when you look at the heartburning is this, that $530 billion of imports are coming into China. But if you look at the composition of those imports, they are not necessarily wholly and solely manufactured in China. So much of that $530 billion of imports that are taking place into United States are in one way or the other way also contributed by the American companies. Right. And there are intermediate products which are being produced by either the American companies or the Chinese companies. For instance, $200 billion are computer related electronics. So all the American laptops and computers and hardware is now actually being manufactured, which is being used by American organizations and citizens, is actually manufactured by China, right? And Americans, on the other hand, don't really have the competitive products which they can sell to China. So they're forcing China to accept their beef and agriculture products and soya beans and agriculture products. I mean, this is where the situation is. So the US hope that they will shift the production to countries like India, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh and others. May or may not necessarily work. It can take a number of years. So the specter of the conflict looks very big on the face of it, but its practical realization cannot take place very quickly.
Now, in the context of proxy wars that we talked about earlier, and then global trade, how does this bode for the Asian century that we heard so much about? I mean, the Asian century depended on a generally harmonious relationship in which there was one superpower.
There's a very interesting statement. There's a piece recently written by the current Singapore Prime Minister Hsien Loong, in which he argues that when Deng Xiaoping told Rajiv Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister in 1988, that the next century will be the Asian century, he also said this, that this Asian century is not necessarily inevitable. It's not something that's necessarily going to happen. So the argument of the Singapore Prime Minister is this, that the Pax Americana after 1945 that provided strategic contacts and peaceful relationship has allowed for the growth of the Asian century. And now the confrontation between United States and China actually threatens the rise of the Asian century. But there are certain other parameters which are very interesting, and most people don't realize this, that there is a basic underlying imbalance in the global system of control and utilization of resources or economic growth as a result of approximately 300 years of colonial Western colonialism. The global population is around 8 billion at the moment, slightly less than 8 billion. So let's say it's 8,000 million. Out of that, 4.5 billion or 4,500 million of that's living in Asia. Out of that, more than 3 billion is only living in India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh and countries. Well above 3 billion, right? The highly affluent population of North America and Western Europe is anywhere not more than 700 million. United States, Canada, part of Mexico, and key countries of EEC, Australia and New Zealand, right? So this less than 10% population of the world is utilizing, controlling and structuring almost 60% of the global resources, right? And this is a natural imbalance. So with the peaceful rise of China and taking its position within United Nations, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, FATF, NSG, Nuclear Supply Group, would also mean that there is a peaceful transition that is taking place without war from the west to the east. Now, of course, the United States and its allies, especially the UK and United States, are unnerved by that transition, right? So much of the demonization of China looks like as if China is militaristically and very aggressively or assertively changing the balance of power. But in reality, China is 1.4 billion people. So China is penetrating into the United Nations, into human rights, into World Bank, into FATF, into NSG Group. It is penetrating everywhere, which is actually a problem. Look at WTO, World Health Organization.
So my final question to you is that how do you think they can repair the relations such that we do see the Asian century come about? Because that's what we're directly interested here.
You see, look, much will depend upon the US election, because the kind of intensification which Trump has done at the moment is not going to be easing with the closure of the look a number of the steps which are being taken, the closure of the consulates, the visa bans on the Chinese students, 11 Chinese firms being sanctioned, and so much of the other narrative that is being shaped. So this is going to increase till the election. After the election, the bipartisan consensus against China will still nevertheless be there, but possibility of a new effective trade deal and lessening of the tension will definitely be there. In either way, either it's Donald Trump or it's Joe Biden, perhaps Joe Biden, but tensions will somehow or the other come down.
Do you think India can play a key role in this, in that if it does not side with the United States is less likely to take China on?
India is a crucial country. I mean, if China is 1.4 billion, India is also 1.3, 1.4 billion. The balance of power essentially depends upon where the India would stand. And my suspicion is this, that whereas you find the ordinary Indian citizens very angry and upset because of the Golwan and the Ladakh conflict, but when the sanity will prevail, when the dust will settle, the Indian intelligentsia, which is spread between Calcutta, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai and all of that, when they finally mull over it, I don't think they will be willing to take as assertive position, fight unto death kind of position against China, the way United States wants them to.
We thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.